In this video, we're looking at some definitions related to demand. So when we look at the demand curve, we're looking at the relationship. So let's just write this out. Demand is the relationship between price and the amount that consumers are willing and able to buy. So in previous videos, we looked at how we can show how much consumers are willing to buy. We could look at that as indifference curves. We could look at that as marginal utility. We looked at what you're able to buy. So we looked at the budget line, and it's what you are willing and able to buy combined that helped us find the quantities that you're at each price. So when we were looking at those optimal consumption points, it was the amount of two goods that you were willing, based on what you liked, your preference, and what you were able to buy, the budget line. So that gave us the combinations of two goods or services that you were willing and able to buy. We then changed the price, held everything else constant, ceteris paribus, and looked at, as you change the price, what happened to that quantity that consumers were willing and able to buy. So we've previously derived the demand curve, and demand itself is the relationship between the prices and the amount that consumers are willing and able to buy. So we have shown that at high prices, the quantity that consumers are willing and able to buy is going to be much lower than at low prices, the amount that consumers are willing and able to buy. So demand shows this overall relationship. It shows how when prices change, the quantity demanded changes. So we really need to be clear on the difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded. So when you change price, like when we drop the price here, it does not change demand, it changes quantity demanded, because demand itself is this whole relationship. Quantity demanded is the amount consumers are willing and able to buy, so based on preference and based on budget, at a specific price. So when you change the price, you change the amount that consumers are willing and able to buy. You change quantity demanded. Whereas demand is this overall relationship that shows at high prices, the quantity is low, and at low prices, the quantity is high. So let's dive into this in a little bit more detail. One way to derive the demand curve is to simply take an individual and ask them how much they would be willing, so how much they like it, and able, how much can they afford of a particular good. So here we have Tim Hortons coffee. So we could ask somebody how much they would be willing to and able to buy if Tim Hortons coffee was, say, $1. So if Tim Hortons coffee was $1 and the quantity was 5, we would put a dot there. So at this price of $1, quantity demanded is 5. If the price of coffee was $10, let's assume that they're willing, okay, they like coffee, but not as able because it's now really expensive. So at the high price of $10, the quantity demanded is 1. And we could fill out the rest of this, which is called a demand schedule. The demand schedule is a table that shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded. That is the amount that consumers are willing and able to buy. And in this case, we're looking at an individual demand curve. Let's say at 10 cents, super cheap coffee, we're willing to buy lots because we super love coffee. Here we have an individual demand curve. We can represent it graphically as a curve, or we can represent it on a table as a demand schedule. In both cases, it shows how when prices change, the amount that we're willing and able to buy changes. It's an individual demand curve. It shows one person's preferences and ability, how much I like coffee and what I can afford based on my income. To find the market demand, we would need to find the individual demand for multiple people. So we could fill out demand schedules for multiple people. And let's just pull some of these numbers over, 10, 5, and 1. 10, 5, and 1. And we would fill out the other numbers as well. To find the market demand, we add up the quantity demanded at each price. So if the second person doesn't like coffee very much, even though they can afford it, so they're able to buy it, they may not be very willing. And so at 10 cents, they're only willing and able to buy 2. So we can then start to derive the market demand curve by adding up the quantities at each price. So we could add up the quantities at each price to get our market demand curve. So again, it would show the relationship between price and quantity. We could show it on a table, the demand schedule, or we could show it on a graph. In our synchronous class, we're actually going to derive this demand curve for our class's demand for Tim Hortons coffee by looking at our individual demand and combining it to find our market demand. So we'll do that together as a class. But we want to look at some definitions here. So let's start with the definition of demand. So it's the relationship between price and the amount that consumers are willing and able to buy. As we said before, it's based on our desire, so our preferences, which we got from indifference curves, or marginal utility, right? This is our preference. And our ability to purchase the good, which is based on that budget line, which showed the maximum we could afford and the trade-offs between. When we look at a demand schedule, that table, we are changing only the price. Whether you're looking at the graph, whether you're looking at the demand schedule table, the only thing we are changing is the price. We are holding everything else constant. Now, what is the Latin term for holding everything else constant? Remember that's ceteris paribus or ceteris paribus. So we're changing the price and we're seeing what happens to the amount that people are willing and able to buy. We're not changing income. We're not changing your preferences. They are consistent. We're not changing the hierarchy, how much you like one thing versus another. Okay, so we're not changing any of those things. We're not changing the availability of alternatives. No change in income, no change in preferences. We're actually going to talk in some later videos about what happens when you start to change those things. What it will do is shift or change the demand curve. But right now, when we look at creating a single demand curve, this is based on only changing price. The price goes down, the amount people are willing and able to buy goes up. So these other factors we're holding constant will change demand, but to create a demand curve, we change the price and that changes quantity demanded. So we got to make sure that we differentiate between demand and quantity demanded. Quantity demanded being the amount you're willing and able to buy, demand being this overall relationship. We said before, market demand comes from adding up the quantities at each price level. So if we do that, if we add up those quantities at each price level, what we find is that our demand curve is downward sloping. Right? We saw that with our Tim Hortons coffee. So the question is why is the demand curve downward sloping? Well, this is the law of demand. The law of demand says that when a price goes up, the amount we are willing and able to buy goes down. So price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. And when the price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So let's break that down into why that is the case. Why do we have a downward sloping demand curve? Why do we have this law of demand? Well, it really comes down to two things: the income effect and the substitution effect. So in our next video, we're going to dive into this income effect and substitution effect. Now, most demand curves follow the law of demand. When prices go up, the amount that you're willing and able to buy is less. And when prices go down, the amount you're willing and able to buy is more. There are goods, however, that don't follow the law of demand, that instead of a downward sloping demand curve, they actually go up like this. They're very rare, but we're going to talk about those in a later video, and those are called Giffen goods. Okay, so Giffen goods, when the price goes up, you buy more. So we're going to be looking at in our next couple videos what makes a Giffen good, why would you buy more when the price goes up, and we're also going to dive deeper into that downward sloping demand curve. What is the income effect and substitution effect?